Welcome back, everybody, to the MATLAB introductory course. Today we're going to continue on our lessons with vectors. And remember, in the last couple of lectures, we were talking about scalars. So I told you in the beginning that there were three types of data, the way the data is structured, right? So a scalar is still a one-by-one matrix. Now we're going to talk about vectors, and then in the upcoming slides we're going to talk about matrices. So a vector is going to be either a row vector or a column vector. They're categorized either by a row or a column. And what that means is that if you are using a row vector, you are going to have one row and multiple columns. Okay, so that's why it's called a row vector. And then if you create a column vector, you're going to have one column and then you're going to have multiple rows. And it seems like it's the opposite of each one, where it really should be, if you have a column vector, it should be multiple columns, but that's not the case. And I'll show you why in a little bit. Okay, so a row vector, you can think of it going across, and a column vector is vertical, right? A row vector is horizontal in terms of data that's lined up. Now what you're seeing here is the commands that we can use in MATLAB to create either a row vector or a column vector. So we'll take a look at these soon enough. Okay? Now one important concept is if you create a vector, you can assign it to another vector, much like we were assigning scalars. So it's very easy. So I create my row vector with multiple values, and then I can make a copy of that row vector and put it into another variable. That's a little typo. It should be x equals y, not y equals x. So that's a typo. So here's another quick example of what a row vector looks like. Okay, so here's a row vector with 5 values, right? So you see the multiple columns, right? So column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a row vector, and then this second line is we are going to increase the size of a vector. So what we're gonna do is, on the 7th element, okay, we're gonna replace that value with -9. So when you do that, it's actually going to add additional elements to the row vector, and obviously put the -9 in the 7th element. Now with MATLAB, when you're talking about vectors, it's not 0 based. So you start with element 1 being 21, element 2 being 22. This is element 3, element 4, 5, 6, and 7. And if you wanted to replace a value in the vector, you can always reference these individual elements by their element number. Now, the accessing a element out of range, it's not allowed. So for example, if I have this row vector, I am not allowed to access the 7th element because it doesn't exist. Okay, in the other example, we were extending the size, and that's okay. But if we were doing a read of the 7th element, because it doesn't currently exist, it's going to give you a out of range error. Okay, so let's take a look at MATLAB itself to do a couple of examples. Okay, so we're taking a look at some of the examples with a row vector. And let's do the first example that we had on our PowerPoint. So if I do 1's 5, okay, if I do that, you'll see that this is going to create a row vector with the value 1 with 5 elements. Okay, so you see that. And then the cool thing is you'll see that the row vector is a 1 by 5, right? And I said that if you have a row vector, you're going to have multiple columns, two or more columns, right? in one row. Okay, so that's a row vector. Okay, and you see the number of bytes allocated, that's the number of spaces that you have allocated in memory, and the data type of the row vector, which is a double. Okay, now if I want to create a column vector, I can do y is equal to zeros, 5, 1. Okay, if I do that, it's going to create a column vector with 5 zeros, okay, and then 1 column. Okay. So if we continue on, we have the row vector x, right? So if I do that, so let's say I want to create a copy of the row vector x. I can say x2 is equal to x. Okay, so x2, now you see on the right, it made a copy of it. It has its own memory space, but it created a copy of that vector. So it's pretty easy to copy a row vector from one to another. It just does it automatically, and that's pretty magical in terms of MATLAB. If you're used to programming in another language, much like C# or C++, and you had an array this way, you'd have to kind of use a loop to copy over the values, specifically C++, to copy all the values of the row vector. Okay, now if I want to extend, let's say x2, I want to make it a little bigger. Okay, I can always do the following. So I could do x2. Right now I have 5, so the 7th element, and I use a scalar. Okay, so this is a scalar. Remember, it's going to be treated as a scalar, and that scalar value is going to be put in the 7th element of x2, which means it's going to extend the size of x2. So let's do that. Okay. Let's do that, sorry. So now you see that we have columns 1 through 6, and then column 7 is -9. So here you saw that we inserted a number at the 7th element, and it extended the size of the vector, the row vector. And then if we want to do many ways to do a column vector. I can probably do this something like y2 is equal to x2 transpose. So what that does, it just turns the row vector into a column vector. So if I do that, right, and I do y2, you see that now I have a column vector. Okay, column vector means that you have one column and multiple rows. The other example I wanted to show you is that let's try and access excuse me, an element in a row vector that does not exist. So let's say that I want to do something like 8. You'll see that MATLAB is going to give you this error that says index in C is the number of array elements, right? So it's okay to extend the size of the row vector by allocating an element that does not exist with a value, but if you want to read from an element that does not exist, then that's going to be a problem for MATLAB. And that's what you get with the index out of range. Okay, so I hope you know the difference between the different types of vectors. We've talked about scalar, right? So 1 by 1. We talked about vectors, and the vectors are separated into 2 categories. You have a row vector, and then you also have a column vector. And I hope you understand the difference between the row vector and the column vector. Thanks for listening, and I will see you on the next video.